PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors of books about Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with Paul Kahan about his book, Philadelphia, A Narrative History.
This week on PA Books, Paul Kahan, author of Philadelphia, A Narrative History.
Paul Kahan is the author of Philadelphia, A Narrative History. Paul, how is your narrative history different from previous histories?
That's a great question. One of the things growing up in the Philadelphia area I noticed is we tell a lot of stories about the American Revolution. We don't so much tell stories about everything else that happened. And I felt as a historian that I was missing out on those things. And so my book, while not slighting the American Revolution, tries to talk about that larger 300-plus year history of the city.
Now, it's hard to get away from the Revolution since it's such a significant part of America's own story. And certainly tourism has a significant role in Philadelphia's economy. When did Philadelphia start to try to use that Revolutionary War history for tourism purposes?
That's a really interesting question. You start seeing it almost immediately. From the turn of the 19th century, Philadelphia begins styling itself as a tourism destination. Not necessarily for revolutionary connections, but for technological progress like the waterworks, for Eastern State Penitentiary, which is one of the most important and significant advances in penal technology in U.S. history. But as you start getting after the American Civil War, you start developing this nostalgia for the American Revolution that really kind of crests in 1876 when you celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And Philadelphia is chosen as the site for the Centennial Exhibition. And everybody pulls out all the stops to develop connections to the American Revolution. This is where we start to get the marketing of Betsy Ross and the flag. We start getting the marketing of sites that are just tangentially related to the American Revolution. And you have millions of people descend on the city to connect with that revolutionary past. And I think the city fathers recognize, there's money to be made here.
So as this type of thing happens, people are creating stories, narratives. There's a lot of myth-making being created. You talk about the concept of a usable past.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
So, the past is not this thing that just happened and exists. It is what we have chosen to remember, what we have chosen to emphasize. And we make those choices based upon our needs in the present. So there's always this sort of presentist, to use a scholarly word, bias to what we think about the past, what questions we ask about the quest, what questions we ask about the past, how we remember the past. And so in writing Philadelphia Narrative History, I very much wanted to provide people with an understanding of how we got to where we are at this particular moment in the past, and to energize them by suggesting, if you don't like where we are, these are the choices that led to where we are. Let's make different choices in the future. But before you can do that, you have to understand how you got to where you are.
And when people create usable pasts, they're thinking about how it benefits them today, or how it perhaps supports political views, or those types of things. And it does tend to focus on perhaps positive aspects of the past rather than some of the negative things. In the antebellum era, there are a lot of anti-African American riots in the city, but those are not part of usually the narrative that a city tells about itself.
That's absolutely true. One of the themes of the book is the absolute pervasiveness of violence against African Americans, against ethnic groups that are minorities. There are these twin strands that I pull apart in the book. The first is, from the very beginning, Philadelphia was a site of incredible ethnic, racial, religious diversity. It was one of the most diverse places in the British Empire. It was the second largest city in the British Empire at the outbreak of the American Revolution. I mean, this was, for whatever you may have heard in Hamilton about New York being, the place where, anything could happen, and this was great. New York was a backwater well into the 19th century. Philadelphia was the place on this continent where things were happening. But as a result, you do have racist, anti-religious bigotry, ethnic bigotry that leads to violence. And so those twin strands of diversity and bigotry are really at the heart of the story that I tell in the book. And it connects to the stories that we choose to tell about the past. Getting back to the riots in the antebellum period. I mean, I grew up outside the Philadelphia area as a professionally trained historian. I knew Philadelphia's history, but I was shocked at the degree to which violence is a thread that runs throughout the city's history, whether it's individual violence or state-sanctioned violence. And I think readers will be shocked to the degree at which there are a lot of anti-Black, anti-religious minority, anti-ethnic violent uprisings throughout the city's history.
How does the city, over time, how do those types of events affect the city's governance?
Well, so it's really interesting. The city's governance is really quite weak well into the 20th century. And then you get these periodic attempts at reform. And so you can understand the consolidation of the city in 1854 when you have the county of Philadelphia, but has all of these sort of villages and towns that get absorbed into the city. And the goal is, among other things, to provide a more routine and regular police function and law enforcement function. By collapsing the city and the county into one entity, hopefully you create a more effective government. And that doesn't really pan out. And so by the end of the 19th century, Philadelphia is being celebrated, in Lincoln Steffen's words, as corrupt and contented. You don't really have the sort of effective municipal services that you would expect in a modern industrial city. And that provokes the progressive movement, which in many ways fails in Philadelphia in a way that it doesn't fail in New York or Washington or these other cities. Philadelphia, by the middle of the 20th century, is still in many ways lagging behind these other cities in municipal services. And in the 1950s, there's this moment of optimism, where we can deploy historic preservation and city planning and technical expertise to create the city of the future. There's this real optimism. And unfortunately, what happens in the 1970s is the federal government basically walks away from cities. I mean, there's this famous New York Post, I think it's the New York Post, headline, Ford to city, drop dead. And your viewers who are old enough will remember Gerald Ford refusing to bail New York City out. And Philadelphia is really stung by the austerity of the 1970s, the Republican-driven austerity. And in many ways, that optimism of the 50s and 60s ends up crashing bitterly on the austerity of the 70s. And you get to the 80s and things just bottom out. And as I talk in the book, I go through these movie representations of Philadelphia as this awful place. And, I cite various movies. There's this little-known John Travolta film called Blowout, which takes place in Philadelphia. Rocky, even though it's an inspirational story. I mean, Philadelphia is very much a character in that film, and it's just depicted as picked over, a ghetto. Even something like Trading Places, which is one of my favorite films, depicts Philadelphia as corrupt and rotten and dirty. So all of these things, it creates this moment where the city seems just, why would you even bother going there? And growing up as a kid in the 80s and 90s, I mean, that was the message that we got, that, you don't want to go in the city, something bad might happen, So I don't know if that answers your question, but...
Well, you mentioned city planning, and that's been a feature of the city from the very beginning. And
absolutely.
Of course, William Penn drew up a plan for his city. Talk about that plan. What was his vision?
So that's the grid plan that we have is actually his surveyor Thomas Holmes' plan, and this idea that the city the streets would meet at right angles, and that Penn had hoped what this would create was a grid plan where people would build houses but have gardens. And there's a certain almost anti-urbanism implicit in Penn's plan. Like, yes, it's going to be a city, but it's going to be a city that's going to be heavily regulated, and everyone's going to be living on these plots of land, and they're going to, there's going to be a lot of trees, and it's going to be a city, but it's not really going to be a city. And Penn tries to govern with a very heavy hand. And keep that in force. And ultimately, it doesn't work out. People subdivide the plots. By the 19th century, people are building, townhouses, that most Philadelphian of institution, and it just kind of collapses. And there's this tension between elite control, which is trying to control space, and the population kind of doing what it's going to do, kind of growing organically and trying to respond and shape the environment to its needs. And periodically throughout the city's history, you have these moments where they say, like, we're going to use space to reform citizens. You get it with the construction of Benjamin Franklin Parkway in the early part of the 20th century. You get it in the 1950s and the 1960s, where they're demolishing quote unquote ghettos and they're replacing them with different kinds of developments. And you get it again in the 20th century, in the 21st century. We're still trying to figure out, what are we going to do with Penn's Landing? How can we redevelop that in a way that reinforces certain kinds of behaviors and values, even as my generation is facing a crushing housing crisis. And, how does that play into it? And so, when people walk away from this book, at the very least, I would hope that they would walk away with understanding how these persistent tensions continue to exist and continue to shape their lived experiences. Again, getting back to that usable history model.
Now, part of Penn's plan included green spaces. Many of the famous squares that are in the city were part of that early plan. But it even grows over time. You have Fairmount Park as this really major urban park. And how does this concept of green space affect the city over time?
So one of the themes in the book is the sense of anti-urbanism, the sense that it is a city, but we don't really like cities. And so we're constantly trying to figure out ways to make the city less city-like. And so that involves the creation of, as you said, green spaces, which the squares were supposed to be places where everyone could come together and have a shared green space. Obviously, it doesn't work out. City Hall now sits on top of one of them. Rittenhouse Square is very different from what ultimately it had been intended to be. But you also get the construction in the 19th century as you start getting factories and the growth of industrialization, this idea like, let's build these big green parks where, basically the plebs can go on their day off. And that's what's behind the construction of Central Park in New York and Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, which is the largest municipal park in the United States. And if you've ever spent any time in Fairmount Park, you know that when you're in parts of Fairmount Park, it's impossible to know that you're in a city. We don't think about it as a city. And that was always intentional. The idea was, as people are living in increasingly small spaces, as they're working in increasingly mechanized and dirty spaces, we will create a space for them to go. Because the idea was, city values are bad, we have to give them a refuge from those places. And again, people adapted those spaces to meet their needs. People adapted those spaces to fill the holes that they perceived in their own lives, which were very different from what city planners may have felt. At the turn of the 19th century, you start getting the construction of municipal parks and swimming pools and playgrounds, but all of which are designed to inculcate a certain set of values and behaviors to the working poor. And when the working poor don't use those spaces the way that elite planners think they should, they become sites of conflict and contention. And we're still feeling this today. We still kind of demonize teenagers for using public space in ways that we don't like, whether it's skateboarding or just kind of hanging out. You know what I mean? We very much try to criminalize those behaviors and move those people along to somewhere else. And as we're learning with the homeless population, if there is nowhere else for them to go, what do you do?
Now, Philadelphia also was a center of intellectual activity for a long time, still is, but as the nation was young and in the colonial days, those were few and far between. Philadelphia becomes a printing center in the colonial days.
Yep.
How did that happen, and what impact did it have?
Well, so what's interesting about Philadelphia is that as a planned and planted city, Penn had been looking not only to create a refuge for his co-religionists, the Quakers, but also to make money. And so religious freedom was not just morally right, it was also good business. And as a result, people came to Philadelphia, not just Quakers, but Anabaptists and other people who either wanted to make a better life for themselves or wanted to be free from religious persecution. And as a result, population grows, you have this influx of people, all of these different intellectual currents, and quickly Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is one of the last colonies founded of the original 13. But within a century is, I would argue, one of the most important, and Philadelphia is the most important urban center in North America. It's more important than Boston, which is a century older. It's more important than New York. It's more important than Savannah. I mean, it is the place to be for this intellectual ferment. And because it is at the head of a major waterway, has connection to the Atlantic Ocean, is on the eastern seaboard, becomes a place where trade sprouts up, but with trade follows ideas. I mean, Philadelphia is very heavily connected to the world of Enlightenment ideals, that coming out of London, coming out of Paris, coming out of all of these places, and is a place where these ideas get disseminated. And as the seat of the colonial government, of course, that encourages the development of newspapers and printing. It encourages the growth of the legal profession, the court system. All of that stuff begins almost a feedback loop that kind of feeds on itself, creating an intellectual center. And then, of course, you need schools to train these people. You need institutions to support them economically. You start getting the creation of large houses that need to be furnished and painted and all of those things. Well, all of that stuff just creates a trickle-down effect that reinforces Philadelphia's centrality economically, politically, and, of course, intellectually.
And of course, you see the development of the Library Company, the American Philosophical Society, and scientific institutions as well. Benjamin Franklin seems to be at the heart of a lot of those. How did he impact the city?
I mean, it would be incredibly difficult to overstate Franklin's impact on Philadelphia. I mean, he casts an incredibly long shadow. And this is a man that's in a generation of long shadow casters. But he comes to Philadelphia as a teenager, has a few coppers in his pocket, and manages through the very judicious cultivation of key political figures and through a lot of hard work to amass a fortune, ingratiate himself in the leading political faction of the city, and uses that to create institutions that are designed to reinforce his status. So, one of the earliest things is the Library Company of Philadelphia, which is founded in 1732. It is the first subscription library in North America, and that means that members would pay dues to the organization. The organization would use that to buy books. And then those individuals who were members could then borrow the books and educate themselves and connect with these larger intellectual currents. Franklin saw this as an attempt at self-improvement with an eye toward developing skills and knowledge that would make him more successful financially, politically, intellectually, however you want to talk about it. And Franklin had the good fortune to be in the printing industry, which in the 18th and 19th century is a place where impecunious but smart men can develop, can educate themselves, can position themselves with the political elite, which of course wants to use the press to get their message out. It's similar to a fellow we talked about several episodes ago, Simon Cameron, who did a similar thing about a century later. So there's some luck, there's some intelligence, there's some hard work, and in creating these institutions that are designed to help him, he creates institutions that help the city. He then branches out into fire insurance because, of course, fire is an ever-present danger in the city. I mean, I write about all of these fires throughout the city's history that are incredibly devastating. He develops what becomes the University of Pennsylvania, but starts as an academy for training students because he says, why are we sending our best and brightest off to Scotland to learn medicine? Why are we sending the best and the brightest off to London to get educations? We could do that here. And so he really lays the footprint for a lot of institutions that continue to impact Philadelphians' lives to this day.
You talk in the book about how early on merchants were the key economic elite in the city, but over time the professional elite would emerge, lawyers, doctors, and others. It sounds like some of these educational and institutions were part of developing those people. Oh,
absolutely. I mean, one of the interesting things about the Quakers is that they have a disproportionate number of merchants. And the wealthy Quakers, the ones who end up buying lots of land in Pennsylvania from Penn, tended to be Quaker merchants. And so they are, I don't know if I want to say overrepresented, but certainly well represented in the colonial elite. And they're the ones that are plugged into developments in Europe, the international finance, some of these intellectual trades. And it's incredibly important for the Quakers to maintain control over the colonial assembly, even though within about 50 years, they're in the minority. And so they do a variety of different things to keep control of the colonial assembly, much to people like Franklin's annoyance. But again, over time, as the city begins industrializing toward the end of the 18th century and then heavily in the 19th century, people who are buying from England and selling as retailers are less important. The true captains of industry are the people who are making things. And that, I think, is one of the things that people don't understand about Philadelphia, is that Philadelphia was an industrial center. And I think we take that for granted, but we made a lot of stuff here. And I didn't even understand all of the things that we made here, all of the brands that people have heard of that were made here in factories. And you see the remnants of them. I went to Temple as a grad student, and I used to take the train into the city, and you would go through North Philadelphia and see the remnants of these factories. But it was even more than that. I mean, many locomotives were made here in Philadelphia. Stetson hats, made here in Philadelphia. Fleer chewing gum, made here in Philadelphia. Things that people used on a daily basis and that drove the economic expansion of the United States were made in Philadelphia throughout the 19th century. I mean, it was an industrial leader. And that's an incredibly important part of the story that I think a lot of times we don't tell. Because what we have now are the rusting hulks of these factories and companies that have long since decamped for other countries. But in the 18th and the 19th century, they were the leaders. And those people ended up moving from the economic elite to, in certain ways, the political and cultural elite through institutions like the Union League and the Committee of 100 and various other organizations.
Now, you talk about part of the industrialization period was anthracite coal, discovering that in Northeast Pennsylvania. How did that influence this industrialization in Philadelphia?
Oh, well, it was absolutely essential. I mean, industrialization could not happen without mechanization, by which I mean turning to steam and then other types of powered machines to do industry. You couldn't develop industry on the scale that it develops in Philadelphia without powered machines. Initially, it's steam, but in order to heat the water to turn to steam, what do? You use coal. And anthracite coal, which is mined around Scranton, becomes the motive fuel of that industrial revolution. And you can sail it right down the Delaware into Philadelphia. It can be processed here in the city, and then it can be sent out to the factories. You have a reasonably short supply chain, and it goes from the ground into the furnaces, powering machines, generating electricity very, very quickly. And that fuels, Philadelphia's location near some of the largest anthracite fields in the world is incredibly important. in a way that if it had been in what's now Florida, or if it had been in what's now Maine, it would have been much harder and much more expensive to transport it, and those costs would have hindered industrialization. Philadelphia, by its location, was sort of in the sweet spot for that first industrial revolution.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Now, along with that, of course, is the development of railroads. And railroads, of course, can transport freight, can transport people. It influences where people live. So how does Philadelphia's growth as a residential community, or people living in different areas, how is that affected by railroads?
Absolutely. So, railroads are incredibly important. They bind the Commonwealth together. I mean, the development of railroads comes along at just the right moment. Pennsylvania is bisected by the Allegheny Mountains, and Pittsburgh in the late 18th century had much more in common with Maryland than it does with what's going on in the eastern side of the state. And it's really the introduction of railroads through the Allegheny Mountains that binds the Commonwealth together and keeps Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania's orbit. I mean, it plays such a key role. In Philadelphia, it connects it to the rest of the United States. It makes it possible to take these goods that are being manufactured in Philadelphia or imported into Philadelphia and transport them across the United States. And so it's no surprise that Philadelphia becomes a center of locomotive production. I mean, if you drive through the Fairmount section of the city right today, you are driving through the remnants of various railroad producers, locomotive production facilities. It's funny, when I lived in Sacramento, and there's this fantastic museum in Sacramento that's a celebration of railroads. Most of their locomotives were made here in Philadelphia. I mean, it's incredible. It has a national and then an international reach. At the same time, it comes along too late to prevent New York from eclipsing Philadelphia. What makes New York, New York, is the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, which makes it possible to transport goods basically from Niagara Falls all the way down into Manhattan, and then through Manhattan out into the rest of the world. And that's the moment where New York becomes a worldwide center, becomes Gotham. Philadelphia, by contrast, is not as favorably placed in terms of shipping. You have to sail up the Delaware. It's kind of a pain. It freezes in winter. New York doesn't have those problems. It's right on the Hudson. Boom, we can go out. So as a result, railroads come along and buttress that industrial development, but too late. And ultimately, the 19th century sees the beginning of the collapse of Philadelphia as the leading city in North America into the second, the third, the fifth. Now I think we're at like 6 or 7 in terms of population. But yeah, it plays an incredibly important role.
Now, also in the 19th century, there are some significant wars that impact Philadelphia, the War of 1812 and the Civil War. How does Philadelphia adapt to those, or how does that impact the economy and the society there?
Well, so Philadelphia as a producer obviously is producing uniforms and weapons. We have several arsenals that are producing weapons. We're a textile manufacturer, the leading textile manufacturer in the United States, so we're producing uniforms. So wars are good for business. They're not so good for our citizenry. And as a diverse citizenry with a lot of attachments, it creates a lot of tension. This is perhaps best illustrated with the Civil War. We are obviously a northern city. We think of ourselves as a northern city. But in the 19th century, Philadelphia's economic and cultural ties to the South were incredibly strong. And so there were many who styled us the southernmost northern city or the northernmost southern city. As a matter of fact, the largest auction of enslaved people takes place right before the Civil War, and it's the estate of Pierce Butler, who is a South Carolinian. He's married to a famous English actress. He had a house here in Philadelphia. I mean, his wealth was such that when you made it in the South, you bought a house in Philadelphia because it was cosmopolitan, it was wealthy, and more importantly, there were a large number of South Carolinian expats living here in the city. And they left a cultural imprint. Even though the first circular against slavery was published in Germantown in 1688, and the first Gradual Emancipation Act in the United States history was promulgated in 1780 by the Pennsylvania legislature. In the 19th century, we're very ambivalent about ending slavery. In Philadelphia. We're very ambivalent about black people in Philadelphia. There's a lot of racism. And there are a lot of, the Underground Railroad has a lot of terminuses in Philadelphia and in Chester County, but shockingly, you also have Southerners who are coming up and kidnapping black Philadelphians, many of whom had never been enslaved, and taking them forcibly into the South and selling them into slavery. It's a very chilling story. So that diversity and that location, which are so important to Philadelphia's story, also, contribute to this tension and this fraught nature. And, we tend not to remember about World War I and World War II that there's a lot of anti-German, anti-Italian sentiment. And of course, we have a large number of descendants of German and Italian families. And they bear the brunt of those during World War I in particular. There's a lot of discrimination that negatively impacts Philadelphians. And it's a really dark period in the nation's history.
Well, let's talk more about World War I.
Sure.
The war, of course, in Europe was going on several years before the United States entered it. Is this another area where Philadelphia benefits economically from this war?
Oh, absolutely. So we do benefit economically. I mean, we have, one of the main industries in Philadelphia in the 19th and 20th century is shipbuilding. And of course, we're building ships not only for the United States, but also for other countries around the world. So shipbuilding is huge, ship repair is huge. Once the United States gets involved in the war, that's a massive influx of not only shipbuilding dollars, but dollars for building uniforms and weapons. And then, of course, drafting men to go and serve in the fight. So yeah, on the one hand, these periodic wars are incredibly economically beneficial, but they also aggravate these existing tensions that exist just underneath the surface. There's a lot of violence against civilians during the American Civil War. There's a lot of violence against pro-Southern sympathizers. There's a pro-Southern newspaper that is attacked in what can only be described as terrorism. So there's a lot of that story, and we tend not to tell that story because it's a complicated story. It's a hard story to tell, but it leaves lasting scars. And even though the Civil War answers the question of are we to be slave or are we to be free, it doesn't answer the question of what does that mean for African Americans? What role are they going to play? Are they going to be socially equal, culturally equal, politically equal, or are they going to be sort of second-class citizens? And there are a lot of people, even abolitionists, who argued they should remain second-class citizens. And Philadelphia had a very large black population. And they, of course, are at the vanguard of pushing back against that. And it's still something we struggle with today. In my lifetime, the city of Philadelphia has bombed a predominantly black organization because we just resort to violence. We don't stand back and think, is this the best thing happening? And the remnants of that move bombing are still with us. We're still uncovering misappropriation of moved family remains, first at Penn and then at Princeton. It's a shocking story. And I know I'm bouncing around quite a bit, but these themes that run throughout the book are themes that I see continuing throughout Philadelphia's history. And you begin tugging on them and you see how they connect to all of these events that we think we know so well, but actually are kind of interwoven and interconnected.
Now, one of the themes is the diversity that we've talked about, and Philadelphia has a Chinatown. It's been in the news more recently because of a basketball arena.
Yep.
People want to build a basketball arena in the area. When does Philadelphia begin to develop a population within the Chinatown community?
So that happens towards the end of the 19th century, largely because of exclusionary policies put into place by California. California enters the Union in 1850, the Civil War happens, and then of course you get this push among Republicans at the national level to build a transcontinental railroad. This is like the dream, one of the dreams of the Republican Party, and they finally achieve this. The golden spike is hammered in Utah in 1869. Well, building that railroad, at least on the western side, were a lot of Chinese immigrants who had come to California to work on the railroad. Once that construction takes place, Californians look around and say, this is not what we signed up for. You need to go. And the United States passes the first exclusionary immigration legislation. The first exclusionary immigration legislation is in 1790 when Congress bars black people from emigrating to the United States. But in 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevents Chinese from coming to the United States and gives California cover to basically push the Chinese already here out. And so they are kind of forcibly dispersed, and one of the places where they end up is Philadelphia because there are jobs. And so they begin building a community that forms the basis of our Chinatown, which is relatively small. It's a few blocks, but it is one of the oldest and best known Chinatowns on the East Coast. And the fact that it is embroiled in this controversy about the arena tells you everything you need to know about the ongoing tension between diversity and discrimination that we face. I mean, it's historically significant. It's incredibly important. It's a story that has deep resonance for Philadelphia, but we want to build an arena on it. And, I mean, if it were a revolutionary building, if it were where Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, we wouldn't be even discussing it. People would think you were crazy talking about that. But again, it's in creating a usable past, you begin pulling at these threads and seeing, my God, it's still with us.
Now, Philadelphia has also, as many big cities do, it had political machines.
Sure.
One of the most famous was the Vere brothers. So who were the Vere brothers?
So the Vere brothers were contractors, basically. And we should take a step back. So for the first 100 or 200 years or so of the city's history, about 150 years, most political parties were kind of unstable. They weren't political parties like we think of them with stable infrastructure. They're here. The United States went through several political systems. After the Civil War, you really get kind of the freezing in place of the Democrats and the Republicans. And because of the way that the war ends up working out, Republicans end up in control of Philadelphia, and they are going to make sure they remain in control. So for 70 years, from about 1860 to the middle part of the 1930s, Republicans control the city. The Veres are one segment of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is not unified. There are these various segments at the local level, at the regional level, at the state level that are vying for control, because Philadelphia is an incredibly important plum. It is this industrial center. There's a lot of money going through here. If you know how to manipulate the system, you can become very wealthy. And that's what the Vere brothers are all about. They're about manipulating that system. They are part of what Lincoln Steffens calls that corrupt and contented, where they, give out patronage in the form of government jobs and contracts to their supporters. Their supporters, in turn, show up and continue to vote for the Vere family candidates, who then continue doling out government jobs and contracts. But the Vere brothers' control over the city eventually collapses. In part because it's incredibly hard to maintain control, and in part because you have other factions of the Republican Party that are vying for control of this incredible peach. Once you get to the Great Depression and the New Deal, however, you have this historic realignment where the Democratic Party, which had been on death's door prior to the New Deal, gets a second breath of life, in large part because the Republicans' answer to the Great Depression is don't do anything. And that's coming from the national administration. Democrat FDR comes into office, builds a coalition not only of good government types, but also African Americans and what we would call white ethnics, the children and the grandchildren of immigrants, Irish, Italian, many of them Catholic. And he builds what becomes a political machine that controls the city in the 1950s, 1960s, up to today. I mean, Philadelphia is a democratic city, and the Republican Party barely exists. But you do go through these periodic machines, and you do go through a lot of periods where municipal government's not great. Municipal government in the 18th century is pretty bad. It's one of the reasons why Franklin is constantly coming up with plans to improve things. All of these voluntary associations. We're going to have a subscription library. We're going to have fire insurance. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. In part because the municipal government doesn't have the resources or the will to do anything. Even after you become a country and, the Commonwealth becomes a state, and we have the United States, the city governs with a very light hand, and it's one of the reasons why it's not able to prevent the riots that happened in the 1830s and 1840s. They consolidate, but again, you're still a very small municipal government for a very large space. I mean, Philadelphia is a large physical area. It's somewhere between 140 and 150 square miles. It's massive as cities go. And policing that and cleaning that and providing it water and transportation is a daunting task that the municipal government in almost every instance fails to succeed. So, if you're watching this and you're complaining about the city government, know that Philadelphia city government today is better than at any time in the history of the city, and you can take that to the bank.
Well, you talked a little bit about the New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
So take us back there for people who may not know what the New Deal was.
Sure.
So what was it?
So in the 1920s, there had been this massive, these were good times. People are making money, they're buying things on credit, things are great. If you're white, if you're black, things are still terrible, and that's an ongoing story of American life. But then you get the economic collapse that is generally dated to the collapse of the stock exchange in 1929. It doesn't actually cause the Depression, but it's a signal that bad times are coming. And by the time you get into 1930 and 1931, unemployment has spiked, factories are shutting down, something like 25% of the population is out of work. And the Republican government that had been in office since the presidential election in 1920 doesn't have an answer to this. Their answer is austerity, which, we're just going to cut budgets and see how that goes. And the answer is it makes things worse. And so when Franklin Delano Roosevelt runs for president in 1932, he promises a New Deal. And no one knows what that is. But he says, I'm going to do something. We're going to try a bunch of different things. And the things that he tries involve spending a lot of money. You raise taxes and you pump that money into the economy. You give people jobs. And unemployment comes down. Things get better. And when Roosevelt tries to pull back on that in 1937 and 1938, when people say, oh, you're spending too much money, the unemployment rate rises. What really kills the Depression is, of course, the entry into World War I. But World War I is like the New Deal take on steroids. It's like everybody's going to have a job. We're going to be building things. We're going to be sending them to war. I mean, it clearly demonstrates that the New Deal works. Well, as part of that, there's all of this money floating around to put people to work. You get artists painting murals. You get them building post offices. You get them going into places like the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and writing different kinds of indexes that we still use to this day. I use them in researching this book. So they leave a lasting impact on the city and its life. And ultimately, it kind of signals this new moment where the federal government is going to play an increased role. And the so-called golden age of the city in the 40s and 50s owes a lot to that federal government money. It allows the municipal workers to be making middle-class wages. It allows the city to do things like really ambitious urban planning projects. When in the late 60s and early 70s, first the Nixon administration and then subsequent Republican administrations began throttling back on that money for cities, that's when things take a really negative turn in Philadelphia.
Well, I want to talk about deindustrialization.
Sure.
Philadelphia, as you had mentioned before, was one of the major industrial centers in the United States, but eventually that comes to an end. Talk about deindustrialization. When did it happen and why?
Sure. So one of the things to understand about Philadelphia is Philadelphia actually has a very, very varied industrial economy. It's never a one industry town like Detroit. Detroit makes cars, car parts. We're never like that. We are making all kinds of things, whether it's textiles and carpets, or it's armaments, or it's trains. I mean, we do it all. Glass, huge in the city. So we have a very strong and very varied industrial base, which you would think would mean that, like, when one industry slows down, the city itself isn't negatively impacted. Whereas in, like, Detroit, the car manufacturer goes, the entire city goes with it. The problem becomes that as the country moves westward, you get the creation of newer factories that are closer to the resources that they are going to be exploited. So in the 18th century, Philadelphia's location near the anthracite coal fields made it the ideal location. But as you start moving further west and you start making things out of iron and steel, and you want to sell them in the western part of the United States, Philadelphia's location becomes a serious handicap. And you've got all of these legacy industries that are in increasingly old factories. And so by the turn of the 20th century, those factors are really beginning to weigh heavily on Philadelphia's economy. You know, Chicago goes from a nothing city in the centennial to be the leading shipping and meatpacking city by the turn of the 20th century. Its star is rising as Philadelphia is collapsing, in large part because of its location. So by the 1920s and 30s, you're beginning to see the outlines of deindustrialization, by which we mean factories are closing, industries are disappearing, and increasingly people are being left without jobs. This is something that will begin happening to the rest of the United States in the 1950s and the 1960s, but Philadelphia's kind of like the canary in the coal mine. We begin seeing it right after World War I. And it erodes Philadelphia's tax base. It erodes the economic resources that could be brought to bear to solve Philadelphia's municipal problems, its physical problems, its crime problems. And ultimately, it creates a cycle whereby Philadelphia begins kind of dying 100 years ago.
Now, you often talk about the golden age as the 1950s. So how does the slow decline of industrialization match up with this golden age?
So I talk about it, but in quotation marks, because for many people, that's the golden age. Particularly people who lived in the city during that period, like that's the moment where everything was great. You had Dick Clark and pretty young Philadelphians dancing on television. They were listening to tame music. Everything was great. What I want to suggest is things were not as great as they might seem, that Philadelphia was racked with political, economic, racial, religious tension. I mean, it becomes a place where McCarthyism rears its ugly head. If you were black or you were gay or you were part of a political or ethnic minority, things were not so great for you. So there are multiple stories to tell. And for some people, it is the golden age. For some people, it's the golden age. And that is something I want people to understand, that there is no one Philadelphia story. There are Philadelphians with different stories. But that being said, World War II provides a massive opportunity for the United States. Germany, which was the industrial heartland of Europe, is destroyed. England is destroyed. France is destroyed. I mean, all of these places, Japan is destroyed. All of these places that were potential competitors to the United States were absolutely destroyed. And U.S. foreign policy is hemming the Soviets in so that they can't become an economic competitor to the United States. So the United States has this 25-year period after the war where it's got no serious competitors. It's not destroyed by the war. It's got these factories and it's churning out products. And it raises the standard of living, not only of Americans, but of Europeans, building these products. The problem is there's very little investment in ensuring that continued development. And so by the 1970s, Germany is coming back online, Japan is back online, England is coming back online to a certain extent. And now you have serious competitors. And so for these industrialized cities that had kind of, I think, thought the good times would go on forever, now you have very serious competitors, and it's part of what kills Detroit. Philadelphia, by being a varied economy, is somewhat protected from that, but again, deindustrialization starts in Philadelphia in the 1920s. So yeah, there's this influx of federal money, and there's this, sort of opportunity for industrial renaissance, but it's too little too late, and it's not sustainable. And, just as these other cities are experiencing economic declines in the 1970s, so is Philadelphia.
Now, earlier we talked about printing as Philadelphia being a center of printing in the colonial era. In the 20th century, we have new media coming online, radio and television. And how do those industries begin in Philadelphia?
Oh my goodness, and this is something I don't think people fully appreciate. They can understand that we were a printing hub because Ben Franklin and printing presses and all that stuff. But television is developed here in Philadelphia. Some of the earliest developments in what become television media are developed here in Philadelphia. One of the most important manufacturers of radios, which becomes the social media of its day, is Atwater Kent. And the Atwater Kent Radio Company is headquartered here in Philadelphia. And so because they're making these devices, right, they're creating the content for these devices. And so local news is pioneered here in Philadelphia. That action news format, and for Philadelphians who are watching this, they're hearing the action news theme in their heads, so you're welcome. That model of local news where we go there and we show you footage, and if it's bloody, fantastic. That's pioneered in Philadelphia. So, those technological developments which change fundamentally American society and American culture, headquartered here in Philadelphia. Major corporations are making those devices here in Philadelphia, and of course we're creating the content for them here in Philadelphia. And that's a part of the story I think most people don't know. They don't know how those key 20th century technologies have Philadelphia's DNA running right through them.
Well, we've been speaking with Paul Kahan. He is the author of Philadelphia, A Narrative History. Paul, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.